Unfortunately, though, I was 15, and so I came home and thought I knew everything. I know that's a shock because most 15-year-olds don't think that, but I did for some reason. And so I didn't understand the importance of continued treatment. I thought that I went to Menninger, I'm well, I'm doing great, I can just go home, and this is how my life's going to be. And so unfortunately, you know the end to that story. I relapsed about a year to 2 years later. And the relapse was, in my opinion, worse than the first time. Because the first time I went to treatment, I didn't know treatment existed. I didn't know that there was help for me. I didn't know that there was true programs that worked with OCD. The second time I knew that those things existed, I knew what work I needed to do, but I couldn't do it myself. And so I was really down and really struggling and had really low motivation because I started to think, what is the point? If this is what it's going to be like for the rest of my life, then this is not a life worth living. And I went down this path of every day, again, feeling sorry for myself and not wanting my illness and wondering why I was going to have to do this extra work all the time. And so I went back to treatment. At the time, Menninger had moved to Houston, so it was in Houston when I went back, and I was 17. And I went back for about 6 weeks that time. And that time, treatment wasn't as successful because I didn't have the same motivation. And because I wasn't willing to fully accept the fact that I would live forever with a chronic mental illness. And so I went to treatment. I did get a little bit better, and I worked hard, but not necessarily the same success we saw the first time around. And I went back home, and I continued in treatment. And what happened is I slowly started to continue to get better, but I also slowly started to accept my disease. I remember one day finally kind of thinking to myself, okay, you have two choices. You can wake up every morning and you can hate your illness, you can hate having OCD, you can be mad that this is your life, but it's not going to change anything. Or you can wake up and say, yeah, I might not love it, this isn't the life that I would necessarily want, but these are the cards that I was dealt. And I need to be okay with that and move forward. And when I shifted my mentality to this mentality of acceptance, a lot of things started to change. You see, I started to accept the fact that life with a chronic mental illness does look different than individuals who can live life without a chronic mental illness. But that definition doesn't have to define who I am. I did my PhD at U of H, and Brene Brown was one of a graduate at U of H and somebody I do a lot of work with. I don't know how many of you in this room know her work, but most of her work and research is on vulnerability and shame. And we've talked a lot about the fact that my story and my struggle with mental illness, it's so much about tapping into vulnerability, accepting it, talking about it, living with it, being okay with it, and the courage that takes, but also the way it changes the outcome. Brene's favorite quote that I use all the time is that when we deny our story, it owns us. But when we own our story, we get to write the ending. And I don't think there is a single quote more true for my life than that, which is that the years I spent hating and being mad at my disease, it owned me. It robbed my childhood. It robbed my life. But the moment I finally said, you know what, this is my life, I can accept that, but I'm going to write that ending, was when things really started to shift for me. I engaged more in treatment. I worked harder. I set goals. I set a goal of high school graduation, which I thought was impossible. And out of all the degrees I have now and the things that I do, there has never been a more proud day in my parents' eyes than the day I walked across the stage from high school. Because as a parent, when you've seen your kids struggle so much and you see that first milestone where they've really made that jump from being a sufferer to a survivor, you couldn't be more proud. And so after treatment, I was really angry, I still am, at the system and the process and the fact that I was lucky. I can stand before you and complain about the years it took for me to get help, and I could stand before you and talk about the disparities that I went through. But the reality is that my outcome and my story should not be the exception, it should be the norm. But it's not. My parents have spent well over $500,000 in my treatment. I still go to therapy once a week. I pay $250 an hour. It's not cheap, but it saves my life. Why do finances have to dictate that? Why does geographical location have to dictate that? There's people with the finances that live in areas where there's not an OCD provider, there's not treatment available, and so they're at that same dead-end road as somebody who can't afford treatment. And the one that I'm trying my best to make a really big difference in is, why does stigma have to dictate that? Why does society and individuals view brain disease different than the body? OCD is a neurobiological disorder. I was born with this illness. I would have OCD no matter what. Was it triggered at a certain time in my life? Are there all sorts of different reasons that we could put together to say maybe this is why? Sure. But it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Because the reality is that I was born with this disease. I didn't choose it. My parents didn't do anything for me to have it. I would have done anything and still would to not have this illness. And so the reality is that we watch mental illness rob children of their childhood, rob adults of their entire life. And it's time that that stops. The only way that's really going to change is when we start collectively working together and sharing our story. At the age of 17, I became the national spokesperson for the International OCD Foundation, and we did this campaign, and it had a photo of me, and it said, "What does OCD look like?" And it said, "Me, my name's Elizabeth." And that's it. And it was one of the most powerful campaigns. It was certainly the most powerful campaign in OCD history, because nobody had been willing to put their face out there and say, I live with this disease. 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, people whispered the word cancer. They didn't talk about it. It was a hidden disease. Sometimes there was stigma around allowing children to play with other children with cancer, right? There was all this misunderstanding. But those first vulnerable parents that were willing to put a photo of their child without hair and on an oxygen tank on billboards and in newsletters and in print advertising across the nation are the people that started to make a difference. And today, nobody whispers about cancer. When you say you have a cancer diagnosis, people are supportive, they're compassionate, they're empathetic, they're there with you, walking you through it, trying to get you the best care and trying to make sure you feel as supported as possible. Yet when you tell somebody you have a diagnosis with a mental illness, they often turn their head, they don't know what to do, and they sometimes quit talking to you. We're all guilty of it, myself included. When you drive down the street, I don't know what San Antonio is like compared to Houston, but Houston's a pretty busy area. You can see all sorts of things happening on the side of the road. And if I'm driving down the road in Houston and I see somebody fall over, what do? Like if they appear to have a heart attack. Call 911, hopefully. I pick up the phone, I call 911, I report the incident. Maybe if I'm licensed, I might administer CPR, who knows. But we know what to do. But when we're driving down the road in Houston and we look over and we see somebody clearly in a psychotic episode talking to themselves or walking around, what do most of us do? We lock our doors and we drive off. And I'm not blaming you, I'm not blaming us, we're all guilty of it. But it is time that we make a change for mental illness. And the only way we're going to do that is to speak out. Out of all of the things that I've done and all of, the things I'm proud of in my life, the one determining factor that keeps me motivated and that encourages me to do the work that I do is knowing that my story may help someone else. When I decided to go public about my illness, it was tough and it was hard, and I was on a lot of national shows, and some of them were really great and some of them were really awful. They wanted to purposely trigger me and take me into these environments so that they could get drama for TV. And I didn't understand it, and I was frustrated. I was young, but it was at that point, it was kind of already out there. I couldn't go back, and so I kind of went with the flow. And I wondered, is this worth it? Why am I doing this? And then the first email that I got from someone telling me that my story saved their life, or that my story made them realize they're not alone, or the emails that I get from individuals saying my stories made them realize that there was help available and that they sought treatment for their OCD and they're doing better now, made it all worth it. I'm encouraging all of us to start to take a stance against mental illness. Because you see, what happens is that when we tell our stories and we put a face on an illness, stigma starts to wipe away. People, you can't have a face-to-face conversation with someone you love and someone you care about and allow those stereotypes to still be there. If we talk about it, things will change. I remember after I did the national campaign, I got a phone call from a reporter, and I was doing an online magazine article, like a phone call interview. And I remember the reporter saying to me, well, what does OCD look like? And I said, I don't understand your question. What do you mean? And she said, well, you have a picture of you and, you're a very pretty young girl, and I just don't, that's not really what mental illness or OCD looks like. And so my response was, well, then explain to me what it does, because I guess I don't understand either. Mental illness looks like me, it looks like you, it looks like your family members. It does not discriminate. There are not certain people that are more likely compared to others. 1 in 4 individuals will deal with a mental illness at some point in their life. We have to decide if we're going to turn our head or if we're going to face it head on, as a society, as practitioners, as family members. What I'll end with is a quick 2 quick things. The first, I'm grateful every day that my parents didn't turn their head. And secondly, I'm grateful that not every provider gave up on me. Because I am standing here today because of faith, family, and treatment. And everybody deserves that chance. Thank y'all very much.